Captain Midnight.
Whatever this movie's called, there will be spoilers for it. I gotta be honest with you, I did not have the highest hopes for Thunderbolts. I'm a big fan of writer Kurt Busiek, one of my absolute favorite comic book guys, and I read him and Mark Bagley's original run well over a decade ago. But it was clear from the outset that this movie version would have almost nothing to do with that, and mostly feature a bunch of B and C-list characters in a film built around the star power of Florence Pugh. Now, I like Pugh a lot, but I've never loved Yelena, and considering the track record of recent Marvel, I don't know, this just wasn't a movie I went into expecting much from. Well, I was wrong. I really enjoyed Thunderbolts, or the new Avengers. It's not perfect, maybe it's not the most tightly written movie in the world, but man, the more I thought about it, the more I liked it, which is, I think, pretty rare for a superhero movie, especially these days. And I think that's worth talking about. Before I get into it, thanks to everyone who subscribed last week. I really enjoyed reading all your thoughts on my Prince of Egypt video, and if you haven't subscribed yet, I definitely appreciate that too. Alright, so I'm going to start with something that may not sound like super high praise, but I think it's really important to talk about just up front. Absolutely nothing about Jake Schreier's Thunderbolts reinvents the MCU wheel. Basically every ingredient found here is something we've seen from Marvel before. The comedy, the destroying NYC third act threat, the found family setup, the references to past films. None of this is radically different than what we're used to. And if you absolutely despise the MCU and all the films within it, I don't think there's much here that's going to change your mind. But what separates Thunderbolts from so many of the recent efforts is just how well this is all handled and executed. With something like Captain America: Brave New World, it's hard not to feel like what ended up on screen was a highly compromised product. A mishmash of visions and ideas that all got ground down into a jarringly edited movie that doesn't have much to say, despite having a lot of story elements that could have lent themselves to a more focused film. Thunderbolts just never feels like that. It may suffer from a mildly overstuffed third act, as these films often do, but I think it overcomes that issue on the strength of its surprisingly strong characterization. I already mentioned Yelena, so let's just start there. Florence Pugh's performance is the heart of the movie, and in my opinion, she's just fantastic here. I didn't mind the character in Black Widow, but she couldn't help but feel like something of a cynical brand extension in that movie, a way to keep the whole thing viable now that Scarlett Johansson was done with Marvel. And that just doesn't seem like the case here. You know, I'll say it, as someone who was never huge on ScarJo's take on Black Widow, Thunderbolts cements Yelena as a character that I'm just far more invested in than I ever was with her. The movie begins with Yelena at an absolute low point, doing slick secret spy stuff, but doing it absolutely purposefully. Depressed and adrift, searching for meaning beyond the grind of the violence that she's been used to for decades now. She's tasked with a mission from Valentina, which turns out to be a trap, leading her to be stuck in the same compound as Ghost, John Walker, Taskmaster, and a guy named Bob. Now, Taskmaster is not long for the film, which wasn't exactly shocking considering the marketing that they built up around one of these characters dying. I expected it to be her going in. What I didn't expect, though, is for Yelena reflecting on her death. Two characters I previously did not care about at all to be so effective. With Yelena seeing a reflection of her own life in the now dead villain and being completely certain that she's going to wind up coming to the same end. Someone who killed a lot of people and was ultimately killed in return. It's a quick conversation, but it effectively sets up how Yelena sees herself and the life she feels trapped in. Isolated, unimportant, and ultimately damned. Now the rest of the gang shows up with their own baggage. Hannah John Kamen and Wyatt Russell are two actors that I've loved on television. They both starred in shows I really like, Killjoys and Lodge 49, but neither has meant all that much to me in the context of the MCU until now. I think that's especially true of US Agent, aka John Walker. I really like how much of an asshole he is here, without just being reduced to a punchline. At first, he can't even fathom being lumped in by Valentina with the rest of these people. He's above them, a true hero, cut from the same cloth as Steve Rogers. On some level, he just knows that isn't true. Still, he clings hard to that image of himself, which I think went a long way towards making him more than the one-note bully he could have come off as, while not downplaying his rough edges at all. I think it's a really tricky balance that the movie pulls off well. Now, Bucky also returns, and in a way, the movie seems to be almost apologizing for how goofy of a turn the Winter Soldier becoming a congressman was. I enjoyed how he's still a great superhero, but is objectively just an awful member of the House, completely uninterested in reading the required packets, and is bad at speaking to the press. His motorcycle action set piece here is the most fun I've had with MCU action in a while, too. David Harbour's Red Guardian is also back. Years ago, I really highlighted him as the bright spot in Black Widow. He was funny, but his performance was also able to suggest a depth to this character that wasn't wholly on the page, elevating the material wherever he could. And one thing I loved about Thunderbolts is that the screenplay actually lives up to the performance. He functions as the movie's primary comic relief, just as he did in Black Widow, but here the emotional beats of the film just work really well too. Thunderbolts, being his reference to Yelena's childhood soccer team, is something the movie is able to wring both laughs and some well-written, genuine pathos out of. Now, these two have barely talked since the funeral, despite being desperately lonely, in a way that makes perfect sense in their own, very closed-off way. And that scene on the sidewalk in the third act where they finally talk about this may be my favorite character beat in the film. As for villains, we really have one primary one here. Well, I guess two, counting the Void, the dark shadow side of Bob, and Valentina Allegra de Fontaine, who brings him out. I think some will find issues with Valentina. There's a few things you could point to here. One, which feels pretty undeniable, is that Julia Louis-Dreyfus is basically just doing an amped up version of her Veep character, Selena Myers. Now, I don't have a big issue with this. She's great at it, and it's a lot more entertaining than a lot of MCU villains, but I do think that's probably a valid criticism. Then there's the fact that the CIA director's plan, well, it's just incredibly slapdash and poorly thought out. Like, she pivots on a dime and basically just seems to be making it up as she goes along, hoping that she can save face, and she doesn't care at all who it impacts. Which, I guess historically is a pretty solid take on a CIA director. At the end of the day, though, Valentina is really just there to move along Bob's storyline. And she does that in an entertaining fashion, even if her winning Bob over to become Sentry does maybe feel a little rushed. Now, I think that can be forgiven, especially since it's not like she did a great, thorough job of it. Bob almost immediately asked the obvious question, why would a god like himself have to listen to her at all? And pretty soon, she's just unleashed a massive threat on New York. Now, I will say, I do think the film's first two acts are its strongest. The Yelena setup, the escape from the bunker, the car chase. I don't think I've been that engaged with a series of MCU action set pieces in a very long time. Mostly because these characters didn't feel untouchable. Once they were trapped in that bunker, the stakes did feel real. Like I said though, I really wish they hadn't treated the Taskmaster death as like a marketing gimmick, because that went a long way to solidify that feeling. We've seen the lovable team of losers thing many times before, that's true, but I found this to be a very well done version of that. There were jokes, but it never treated the characters as one-note punchlines, or as absolute badasses who could always hover above the fray, and I think it was also aided by just a really good score. MCU scores often don't stand out to me that much, but this one, composed by the band Son Lux, I think is up there with the best the series has ever produced. When the team starts saving the civilians from Sentry's attacks in a throwback to the first Avengers, I think the music really beautifully communicates the sense that the characters are embracing their desire to actually be heroes for the first time, oscillating from moments of reflective sadness and uncertainty to a booming, more traditional superhero movie sound, as if the team is fighting to be more than what they are right now. It really helps that Bob's story is carried by a fantastic performance from Lewis Pullman, who you may remember as Bob from Top Gun Maverick. If you need a Bob, he's your man. And that holds true here. He meshes with the cast right off the bat and is one of the best additions to the MCU in a pretty long time. I was kind of surprised by how upfront they were about the character's former meth addiction, even if it was handled with a lot of humor, and his childhood trauma, something he shares with both Yelena and Valentina. And while the happy ending here didn't come as a surprise, I found myself really caught up in his story, with his evil void self being a creepy enough antagonist to anchor that last half hour of the movie. The very end, though, I'm a little torn on that. It sees Valentina pulling an impressive Bugs Bunny-esque move and escaping from our super team just in time to introduce them to the world as the new Avengers. I think this move is pretty funny because it's easy to say like, okay, this is just a very cynical move from Marvel to get a new Avengers team on its legs in the final 5 minutes of this fairly standalone movie. But you know, it was a cynical, rushed move from Valentina as well, and it was treated as such, so hey, fair enough. The post-credits scene has Red Guardian saying that they should rebrand as Avengers with a Z to protect themselves from Sam Wilson's lawsuit, which clearly sets up the idea that there are now two competing Avengers teams, and our Thunderbolts crew are definitely the odd ones out, literally appointed by a villain who bought Avengers Tower. Like, Sam Wilson and company really do have every reason to dislike them at this point. But I gotta say, after watching the Thunderbolts, I know which side I'll be cheering for. The new Avengers here didn't reinvent the MCU formula, it didn't do anything particularly innovative or shocking, but it did remind me of why I got so invested in all these movies in the first place, by executing everything I initially liked about them with a sense of purpose that it doesn't feel like the series has had in a very long time.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes too.